Sir, shall we start? Paul, sir.
Yeah, Vidya, please.
Good evening, dear participants. A warm welcome to today's webinar. At the outset, I thank each one of you joining us today. General instructions before we begin. All the participants are hereby informed to mute their video and audio during the program. Kindly refrain from posting messages on the chat box. Participants can post questions in the chat box during the question and answer session. Thank you. We will start in a minute. The rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. John F. Kennedy. At the outset, I, Vidya, Assistant Professor at St. Joseph's Evening College, take this opportunity to extend a warm welcome to our esteemed speakers, dignitaries, colleagues, and students to the international webinar on relevance of human rights in the modern world on the occasion of International Human Rights Day. It is a mark of our tradition to invoke Almighty's blessings. I now invite Ms. Dorothy Deepa, Assistant Professor, Department of Commerce, St. Joseph's Evening College, to lead us into prayer.
Am I audible, Ms. Vidya?
Yes, ma'am.
Let us put ourselves in the presence of God. Let us close our eyes for a moment of silence. Loving Heavenly Father, the core of every reason, the source of love, you have made the earth and the heaven. You are the ultimate goal of every knowledge seeker, the infinite wisdom, the cause of all that is good. Thank you for allowing us today to meet and share our knowledge and time with one another virtually. May you send forth your divine wisdom to our speakers as they impart effectively the good God's given gift to all of us. May they be blessed as they continue to share their expertise to the people who needs them. Bless the participants so that they would be able to obtain vital information from this webinar. We now humbly ask you to join us in our endeavor to explore knowledge. This we ask in your holy name.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a meaningful prayer. Before we further advance into the program, I take this opportunity to acknowledge the presence of our principal, Dr. Albert Joseph Smith, and all the other participants who have joined us today. Without further ado, I introduce the moderator of today's program, Dr. Paul Newman, Associate Professor at St. Joseph's Institutions and Observer at United Nations Human Rights Council, Geneva. He is involved in various human rights related issues relating to Ilam Tamil's right to self-determination, the referendum of the Catalonians, and the Yazidi genocide in Kurdistan. I welcome you, sir, to set the tone for today's webinar.
Thank you. As all of us know, today we are celebrating the International Human Rights Day, which is observed every year on the 10th of December. This was the day the United Nations General Assembly adopted in the year 1948 what we call as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is referred to as the Bible of Human Rights, the very basic document. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in short known as the UDHR, was a milestone document that proclaims the inalienable rights which everyone living on this planet is entitled to as a human being. This is regardless of our race, this is regardless of the language we speak, the color we bear, the religion we practice, the sex we are born with, the political affiliations or any other opinion, the nationality we belong to, the social origin which we are from, the property which we may own or disown, the place of birth or our status, be it economical or social. So, this document affirms that each one of us are entitled to certain rights. This document is the world's most translated document available in more than 500 languages. So, this day is the celebration of the announcement of this document known as the UDHR. So, this UDHR is a document of the UN, a gift to humanity. So, this year, the Human Rights Day theme relates to COVID-19 pandemic and focuses on the need to build back better by ensuring human rights, which is central to the recovery efforts put in by different players. It is by following human rights that we would achieve our common global goals. Only if we are able to create equal opportunities for all, only if we address and expose the exploits of the nefarious elements that are present in our societies. So it is here that we need to apply human rights standards to tackle the entrenched, systematic, and intergenerational inequalities as well as exclusions and discriminations that are faced by the marginalized people living in our society. The 10th of December is an opportunity to reaffirm the importance of human rights in rebuilding the planet which we inherit, in which we live. The need for global solidarity, as well as our own interconnectedness and shared humanity, depends on how far we take this document. It is here that each one of us should stand up for human rights, engage the general public, engage our students, engage fellow teachers, engage people whom we come across, pull them into the UN family, which speaks of sustainable development goals. The heart of sustainable development goals of the millennium, which is supposed to be achieved by the year 2030, is circled around the human rights arena. So, without human rights, we cannot achieve the desired sustainable development. So, it is in this context that today in India itself, we have been seeing various struggles going on. The year began with protests all over the country on the Citizenship Amendment Act. Then we found the migrants from different parts of India walking back thousands of kilometers to reach their places. Nobody knows how many of them perished in this long walk. That apart, right now we are seeing the farmers carrying out a struggle, the people who provide us with our livelihood. Then we have had in between cases like the Hathras case where we have responded but not adequately. Internationally, we woke up to the calls for Black Lives Matter. At the same time, here in India, we also stood up for another campaign called as Dalit Right Matters during the Hathras rape case. It is in this context that we have two great speakers for the day, Professor David Matas and Professor Ted Orlin, both of them personally well known to me, both of them extremely experienced campaigners, people who have traveled extensively and people who have contributed to the development of human rights, especially in the developing world. So now I invite the speaker, that is the first speaker, that is Professor David Matas. Before that, I request Ms. Vidya to introduce him. Ms. Vidya?
Thank you, sir, for setting the context of today's program. It's a great honor to have amidst us Professor David Matas, who is an international human rights lawyer from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, with 3 decades of experience in the field of human rights. He has served as a lecturer in constitutional law, introductory economics, international law, civil liberties, and immigration and refugee law at the University of Manitoba. He was appointed by Government of Canada to represent at United Nations General Assembly. He has been on the board of directors of International Center of Human Rights and Democratic Development. Professor was a member of International Standing Committee of the Amnesty International. He was counselor of the Canadian section of the International Commission of Jurists. Professor Matas has been honored for his exemplary work in the field of human rights. He has received Mahatma Gandhi Peace Award, Advocate of Public Legal Education Award, Governors General Confederation Medal, to name a few. Professor David has authored 11 books, published several international articles, contributed chapters in books, and written manuscripts. Professor has traveled extensively in India and has even visited the Sri Lankan Tamil refugee camps in Tamil Nadu to give a voice to these forgotten refugees at the International Forum. It is a golden opportunity for us to listen to you, sir, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk about the subject matter of this conference, the relevance of human rights today. What we see, as we've heard from the introduction, is that the ethos of human rights is today under retreat. Human rights violators have gained the ascendant. Russia, under Vladimir Putin, holds less of a prospect of respect for human rights than the Soviet Union did under Mikhail Gorbachev, or that Russia did under Boris Yeltsin. China under Xi Jinping is less respectful of human rights than China under Hu Jintao. Belarus under Alexander Lukashenko today is worse in respect for human rights than Belarus under Lukashenko yesterday, because he insists on holding on to power long past his best before date. The government of Sri Lanka has gone from government under Maithripala Sirisena to paying lip service to minority Tamil rights to government under Mahinda Rajapaksa, who ignores and discounts those rights. Islamic fundamentalists active in Iraq, Iran, and Yemen disdain human rights. So do their ideological opposites in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria. The US under President Donald Trump has been openly disrespectful of human rights, denying protection to and mistreating refugees, and developing warmer relationships with dictatorships than democracies. And the COVID-19 pandemic has made matters worse, vectoring racial hatred and discrimination. Minorities are blamed for the spread of the virus. The vulnerability of the disadvantaged is not taken adequately into account. And one could go on, and we heard some other examples from Paul Newman. And given the degradation of the human rights situation globally, one can well ask, is human rights relevant today? Certainly the standards are relevant, although some non-state actors renounce even the standards no state does. Hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. When states violate human rights, they claim that outsiders are interfering in internal affairs, that the critics are worse than those criticized, that the critics are bigoted against the country criticized, that the critics have got their facts wrong, and so on. They do not say that human rights are improper standards. In any case, our touchstone for what is relevant should not be the perpetrators, it should be the victims. We do not hear the victims clamoring for an end to human rights discourse. They do not say that respect for human rights is irrelevant to them. There are, to be sure, gaps in standards. Standards lag behind violations. They need to catch up to technological developments. Because of the internet, we see violations we did not see before. We need internet-specific standards to address these violations. The same is true of cross-border organ transplant abuse. The post-World War II international human rights instruments predate the advent of transplant technology. Mostly, the international human rights system does not address this abuse, and it should. However, gaps in the human rights system do not make that system irrelevant. The need for specificity is not irrelevance of the general. On the contrary, the general guides us in determining what the specifics in any context should be. When it comes to mechanisms, the concern is more pointed. Human rights, like any standard, can become irrelevant if no one does anything about it. But we're not quite there yet. We have been moving in that direction, doing less and less about more and more violations. The question I suggest we need to address is not whether human rights are relevant today, but rather what we can do to make them more relevant today than they are. The relevance of human rights is not some natural phenomenon beyond our control. It falls to us to decide its relevance. Human rights will be relevant to us if we choose to make them relevant. How to make human rights relevant, obviously, is not a question which is going to vex human rights violators. But for victims, human rights NGOs, and human rights friendly governments, it is a question that needs to be answered. I have, and I will go through briefly and quickly, 20 suggestions to make about how we can make human rights relevant to us. Number one, do not be silent. To start off with, rule number one is speak up. The biggest enemy of human rights is indifference. Silence always favors the perpetrators. Showing you know shows you care. Number two, develop and implement an active local human rights policy. A government which complains about human rights violations abroad but pays no attention to human rights at home is not going to be taken seriously. This is so even if local violations are far less serious than overseas violations. In Canada, where I'm from, for instance, there are continuing violations of the rights of our Aboriginal population. It is important for Canada to address these rights directly, not just because of the need to do so for their own sake. Ignoring them would mean undercutting whatever voice Canada might have in promoting respect internationally for human rights. Number three, give human rights priority. Governments are faced with a wide range of competing demands for attention. It is easy enough to push international human rights to one side in favor of the myriad of local issues which are clamoring to be noticed. Democratic governments of necessity are driven by what their electorates want. If the electorates do not insist on respect for human rights abroad, it is easy to put them to one side and focus on the local issues of the day, whatever they might be, which demand the attention of the electorate. Yet, human rights are an underlying foundation for democracy itself. We ignore human rights at our peril. Paying little attention to human rights abroad will come back to haunt us. Number four, make the worst first. There are regrettably so many human rights violations around the world, one would hardly know where to turn. The answer should be that the worst violations should be first in our attention. There may be a tendency to focus on lesser violations because they're easier to remedy. The perpetrators may be more amenable to changing their behavior in minor ways than in major ways. Yet the temptation to seek out easy victories in minor matters should be avoided. To make the combat against human rights violations credible, the worst violations, that is to say, mass killings, genocides, crimes against humanity, should come first. Number five, speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. There are many victim communities who have articulate, informed, well-connected leadership. They need the support and solidarity of others. But it is they and not others who should be at the forefront. There are other victim communities, in contrast, who are so heavily victimized and fragmented that they cannot speak for themselves. It is they to whom outsiders should gravitate to support. When the victims cannot speak for themselves, others must speak for them. Number 6, record and report. Many communities and individuals are victims today and have been victims yesterday. No one should forget their own victimization. We need victims to speak for themselves so that we know what happened. The work of outsiders cannot possibly replace the lived experience which victims can communicate. If victims do not speak for themselves when they cannot reasonably expect others to speak for them. Number 7, do not forget others. A person or community who speaks only about their own human rights violations and shows no concern for the human rights of others undercuts their efforts to promote respect for human rights. A victim community who shows no solidarity for others cannot reasonably expect solidarity of others. Human rights belongs to all humanity. To speak about human rights only in a situation where the speaker is the victim is a form of egocentricity and contrary to the very universality of human rights. Number 8, avoid double standards. Human rights violations occur in many places. For governments or international institutions to focus on only one to the exclusion of all others, or to give disproportionate attention to minor violations in one country and to ignore major violations in other countries, is another way of undercutting the universality of human rights. When it comes to the manner of violations and the details, there are individual facets. Yet these individual facets do not justify an exclusive or disproportionate focus by governments or international institutions or major human rights non-governmental organizations on only one government or only one set of perpetrators. There are regrettably more than enough human rights violations to go around to maintain credibility by avoiding an exclusive or disproportionate focus on one set of violations, one set of perpetrators, or one country. Number 9, expand universal jurisdiction. Many countries have universal jurisdiction laws which allow for prosecution of international criminal offenses which are committed abroad. These laws need to be expanded and used more frequently. They should not become so easy to access that they can be used to try to settle political scores. But today we see the opposite. They are mostly so difficult to access that they are almost moribund. Number 10, limit sovereign immunity. Civil liability laws generally have an exception for sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity laws do typically have some limitations, typically commercial, but grave violations of international human rights are usually not found as one of them. Sovereign immunity should not be an immunity for grave violations of international human rights. Insofar as they do provide that immunity, the laws need to be amended. Number 11, be specific. A lot of human rights violations discourse is general in nature. When that happens, it is easy for perpetrators to pretend that the speaker is talking about someone else. To make human rights concerns bite, they have to be specific. Ideally, not just location should be mentioned, individual perpetrators should be identified. Magnitsky legislation, named after a victim in Putin's Russia, which exists now in only a few countries, but is spreading worldwide, allows for exactly that. Under Magnitsky legislation, named perpetrators are barred entry to the naming country and their assets in the country are seized. That sort of legislation should be expanded and used. Number 12, investigate. When there is compelling, persistent evidence of serious human rights violations, the claim of violations should be investigated and conclusions reached. The evidence should not be just left to sit there unresolved. Investigation should be undertaken by government and intergovernmental bodies. The investigation should not be left to the private sector, individuals, and NGOs. Taking human rights seriously means taking evidence of human rights violations seriously. Number 13, build up institutions. Internationally, the global system for addressing human rights violations is far from complete and often politicized. There are many human rights experts involved in the international human rights systems, but their mandates are often politically driven or circumscribed. We need international human rights systems that cover the full gamut of human rights. These systems need to be professionalized, depoliticized, and independent. Number 14, remain engaged. Raising a human rights violation once is insufficient. To be taken seriously, objections to human rights violations have to be persistent. Advocates to be effective need to be relentless. Giving up means abandoning the victims. Forgetting means leaving the victims to their plight. Violators should never get the message that all they have to do is wait and the objections will dissipate. Number 15, use all remedies available. There's rarely one simple answer to serious human rights violations. There's typically a variety of possible recourses, none of which is guaranteed to succeed. Faced with a panorama of possible remedies, every one should be tried. None should be overlooked. It's not possible to know in advance what is tried will work. All we can know for sure is that something not tried will not work. Number 16, do not accept immunity or impunity. Perpetrators must be brought to justice. If legal systems are in place to bring perpetrators to justice, they should be invoked. If legal systems are not in place to bring perpetrators to justice, they should be constructed. The effort to bring perpetrators to justice must be never-ending. It must continue as long as the perpetrators are alive. There should be no safe haven and no statute of limitations for serious human rights violators. Number 17, protect refugees. We must not forget the perpetrators. We must also not forget the victims. Remembering the victims means not just protesting their victimization. It means giving them practical, hands-on help. If they have fled, they should be given protection. It sends an inconsistent message to perpetrators to protest serious human rights violations, but not to provide protection to the victims who have fled. Denying protection means re-victimizing the victims. Denying protection is a form of hypocrisy, a message to the perpetrators that the protests of human rights violations are hollow. Number 18, reject incitement to hatred. Incitement to hatred against victims groups is both a cause of serious human rights violations and a justification given for them after they have occurred. Human rights work should not be just after the fact. It should be prevented. That means combating incitement to hatred before that incitement has its insidious effect. Number 19, never forget. After the surviving victims have been protected, after the prosecutors have prosecuted and convicted the perpetrators, after the violations cease, the work on serious human rights violations does not end. Those who did not survive must be remembered. Sites of violation should be preserved. Records of the violation should be archived. Museums should display what happened. The history of human rights violations is as much our history as the history of human achievements. We must not forget either the best or the worst of what we have done. Number 20, learn the lessons. Finally, from every serious human rights violation, we need to learn the lessons. We should create a preventive legacy from the ashes of the victims. At the time the victims were killed or maimed, their victimization was senseless. We owe it to them and to ourselves to make sense out of this senselessness, to give meaning to what would otherwise just be meaningless tragedies. So let me just say this by way of conclusion. Human rights today will be relevant if we make them relevant. Are human rights relevant today? You decide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for your very, very concise, extremely sharp, as well as focused talk. What was very, very interesting is, apart from mentioning that human rights is relevant, you gave 20 keys to how to make it more relevant. So that was very, very interesting. And among the 20, the very first one which you spoke, do not be silent, is very much applicable to people living in the developing countries, including India. Because when you look at the democracy index, the democracy in our country, that is India, has sharply fallen down. So this was just last week. There was an article in the Hindu newspaper which makes a mention of the decline of democracy in India. So in this context, it is extremely important that we, the educated people, speak up against violations as well as stand up for the protection of human rights and use each of the 20 keys which you have given to make human rights much more relevant. So I request you to kindly wait so that after Professor Ted Orlin completes his speech, we can take up questions. So now I once again request Ms. Vidya to introduce Professor Theodore Orlin from New York. Over to Ms. Vidya.
Thank you, sir. I consider it great privilege to welcome and introduce our next speaker, Professor Theodore Orlin. Professor Theodore Orlin served as a distinguished professor emeritus of human rights advocacy, Utica College, Syracuse University, New York, USA. Professor Ted has had a long career teaching human rights, political science, criminal justice, criminal law, government and law, and public justice in various universities, including the State University of New York, Boston University, and City University of New York. Professor is a recipient of prestigious awards and honors for his contribution and work in the field of human rights. Presidential Medal awarded by President of Republic of Albania for special civic merits, Distinguished Teaching Award, Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching, to name a few. Professor Orlin also served as Director of Human Rights Advocacy Program, President and co-founder of International Human Rights Education Consortium, and Senior Consultant at the Human Rights Center of the University of Pristina. He was part of UNESCO Human Rights Education Mission to Kosovo. He also participated in 25th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva 2014. He was also the honorary president of the International Human Rights Festival at Albania in 2015. Professor is not new to the Jesuits. In the past, he has delivered 2 lectures at St. Xavier's College, Mumbai, and 1 at Loyola College, Chennai, on human rights, apart from conducting a human rights workshop at Indian Social Institute, Bangalore. A warm welcome to you, sir, and request you to proceed with your inputs.
Hello.
Yes, sir, we are able to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
yes.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I do want to thank Paul for inviting me, and David, your discussion was terribly comprehensive. I'm very much impressed with your suggestions, your 20 suggestions of what we need to concentrate to make human rights a reality. Let me just say that December 10th is an important date. As Paul has noted to you, It is in my mind, the beginning of the internationalization of human rights. In 1948, under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt, and people from all around the world, Rene Casson, Dr. Mehta, and others, they came together to do something that was unique, something that many say, and I believe true, would be very difficult in 2020. They were able to gather the nations of the world, 58 at that time at the United Nations, to gather and to accept in 30 articles principles of human rights. This was the first time it was done, and many suggest that in now the 21st century, it would be an impossible task. And I'm inclined to agree. As Dr. Mattis has made clear, we are at a very difficult point in the world. The notion of human rights has been discredited. There are groups and people and governments all around the world who disdain the very concept of human rights. As Paul has suggested, the trend towards the realization of universal respect for human rights has been declining, not just in India, but I must say all around the world, whether it be Hungary or Poland or North Korea. And in the United States, we are particularly concerned.
Ted,
We have.
excuse me, Ted, I'm sorry to intervene. Will it be possible for you to just unmute your video? We
I've
want to
been
see how.
trying very hard. Let me try again.
Yeah,
What?
I want to show how handsome you are.
All right. What? Start video. Is that
Yes.
okay? Can
Yeah,
you
yeah,
see me
yes. No, no, not yet, not yet.
now? I'm trying, and I don't see. What should I press here?
No, you have to press start video.
I am pressing that, and it says okay.
Same is unable to.
Oh. They're able to detect my camera. Maybe that'll do it.
Yeah.
Where is your camera? Do you want to use mine?
No, it's too late to do that now.
No, it's not. I just click on your one you've got. Make sure your camera is powered on. Where's your camera?
My camera is here.
Yeah, but you just killed it. I don't know.
Can you see me?
No, Ted.
We're having some difficulty with my computer here.
Okay. So if it's not possible, then kindly go ahead. Not an
Well,
issue.
I apologize,
That's
and
okay.
we'll see what we can do. Let me just try to get back here into Zoom, and I'm not being able to do that either. No, I'm not able to reconnect with you. I can't see anything.
That's fine. You're good at human rights, but not good at handling the laptop.
Well, I don't think my laptop is. Oh, here I am. I see you now. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
All right. Well, I apologize. My partner and I, Helen, are looking for what we can do, but it doesn't seem to work. Let me just continue my remarks and let me offer my apologies to all of you. What I am suggesting and what David has alluded to is that we are living in very difficult times. Uh, Human rights has become discredited, not only amongst states, and as I already mentioned, there are critical problems of human rights, not just in India, but we see them all over the world, and we see a trend where the promise of the Universal Declaration is now being sincerely threatened. And David's suggestions within his 20 recommendations are certainly ones we should take into consideration. But I would like to emphasize there is one basic one that we cannot ignore, and that is a realization that a good deal of our population is unaware of human rights. I would suggest, and over the course of years in doing seminars from one part of the world to the other, that in actuality, there are very few people who really know about the Universal Declaration, let alone the complexities of the Human Rights Council or of the various treaties that have made the Universal Declaration a legal obligation. We have failed remarkably in not making human rights part of the fabric of our lives. As Eleanor Roosevelt had pointed out at the time of the Universal Declaration's drafting, that it is important that we take human rights and bring it into our lives, that we bring it into our neighborhoods, our schools, and the like. I would suggest to you that in personal polls that I have taken among students, a vast number of them know virtually nothing about what the human rights message is about. In fact, I would suggest to you that having just witnessed a very difficult election here in the United States, that there are large numbers of people who are not only ignorant of human rights, but are proponents of destroying human rights. We have a growing mass of people who, under the name of American First and right-wing movements throughout the world, who have rejected the very message of universal respect of individuals, of the notion that all are entitled to human rights. It has become popularized to argue that rights should be ignored and that the issues and the alienations of people disrespect the universality of human rights, so much so that in the last 4 years, we have seen the disengagement of the United States from international efforts to protect human rights, and as such, have created a worldwide movement to dismantle the very structures that we've created since 1948. I contend that the deepest problem we have is that our populaces have rejected the very notions that are found within the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. How do we change this? Well, fortunately, we have a change of administrations here in the United States. We hope that we can re-engage internationally and move towards the eventual realization of what human rights are supposed to be, the respect of all individuals. And I must say, one of the positives and one of the few positives of the last 4 to 5 years have been the efforts of people to gather together, whether in the streets, parading, or whether in the media, arguing for the rights of minorities, the Black Lives Matter movement has certainly given us an indication that not is all lost. The recent election, although here in the United States, that shows we are divided with 70 million people voting for an anti-human rights message. Nonetheless, the majority has said that we need to get back on track and re-engage internationally for the protection of human rights. But the core message that I have this morning is that we have an obligation to reteach the very principles that Rene Casson and Eleanor Roosevelt and the others, Malik, made some in 1948, some 72 years ago. We need to make this part of our society, part of our teaching, part of our way of life. Not to do so makes human rights a empty promise that will not be realized. I contend that there is so much concern given the pandemic we're dealing with, given the economic crisis that the world is facing with our own well-being, that it is a difficult effort, but that effort must be made. We must come to the conclusion that if we are to protect our own rights, then we must protect the rights of all. And as David has pointed out, there are a number of institutions. There are certainly a multitude of instruments. There is still a fabric of legality that we need to use. But ultimately, we need to make human rights not just a promise, but a reality. And that requires that we make efforts amongst ourselves and all those who are involved in education and the like to ensure that from the earliest time, from elementary school right to the university, that the human rights message is reiterated, understood, and made a commitment that we will use every effort to make a realization. Times are bad. We're at the crossroads. Now is the time we must indulge in an effort to make human rights not just a promise, but a reality. And I challenge all of us, those of us in this webinar, and all of those of our families and friends to restudy the human rights message, to recommit ourselves to the very notions of what human rights are, and to make it a reality. As David pointed out, there are very serious cases around the world, and they should be addressed first. It is appalling that the refugees in Europe and elsewhere are suffering. It is appalling that there are regimes that deny the right of assembly, the right of free speech, the very principles of human rights that are at the core of our human dignity have been threatened. And now is the time for recommission, to our very basic fundamental principles of human rights, equality, and human dignity. I thank you, and I apologize for your not seeing me, but I hope my message has become clear, and I invite your questions and comments.
Ted, you can try tapping the stop video or on video just once, not twice. Maybe you can try that. So thank you very much for your wonderful disposition. You really spoke about the need for us to once again go through this all important document called as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which comprises of 30 articles. I'm not sure, though we are educators, how many of us have read this all important document. As you said, from what began as 58 countries engaging in the field of human rights in the year 1958, when Eleanor Roosevelt came forward to draft this. Today, we have about 193 countries, USA pulling out quite recently, so that makes it about 192 countries minus Israel, so 191 countries being part of the United Nations Human Rights Council. So, as you really pointed out, it is essential that we teach our students the value and the worth of human rights, especially from the beginning and starting with the basic, that is the UDHR, which is a very, very simple document. It is to be remembered that this document has become part of many constitutions and many constitutional amendments, including the Indian constitution, wherein we have borrowed extensively and incorporated them into our different constitutions across the world. So, saying this, I want to apologize to the participants for not having the third speaker as we had promised. The pandemic has caught up with all of us. I'm sorry to tell you that Dr. Rebecca Lim, who was supposed to join us, is unwell, and doctors have advised her to take complete bed rest. So we have just the two great stalwarts to address the questions. And now I open up the floor for people to ask your questions. If you are unable to unmute your mics, you can just type your questions in the message box, and then I can read them out to the two distinguished scholars. Now it's question time.
Well, perhaps I could begin with a comment.
Okay, yeah, please go ahead.
Because I thank Professor Orlin for his appreciation of my remarks, and I want to express my appreciation for his. One facet of the problem of the degradation of human rights that I think we see, which he rightly pointed out, is it's not just governments, non-democratic governments, pushing human rights aside because it helps them in their own undemocratic rule. We also do see in some countries from electorates in democratic countries a disregard for human rights. And Dr. Orlin attributes that to a lack of education, which may be partly right. But I also think it's attributable to the fact that we're seeing simply more ethnocentricity now, that we're moving further away from the Holocaust. The whole structure of human rights developed after World War II as a lesson learned from the Holocaust. And as the memory of the Holocaust fades and the disaster from ethnocentric policies fades, we forget those lessons, and we are descending into the same maelstrom that generated World War II and the Holocaust. And I think worth trying to bring to the attention of the global human rights community, not just the standards, but why and how we got into them, so that we don't repeat the mistakes of history. And that's the comment I wanted to make.
If I can suggest, David, I'm very glad you brought that up. The very fact is that 1948 was an unusual time when the memory of the Holocaust was very vivid and very real. People had lived through it, and it allowed for a consensus. And I do agree with you that we have become terribly ethnocentric, and the populism of nationality has become, in my mind, the most real threat to the international protection of human rights. How to turn that around and how to make it realized that it's all in our common interest to attack human rights violations wherever they happen is going to be a monumental task. And we have to start rebuilding and reassessing where our priorities are. Black Lives Matter, I think, is a positive step in that direction, but it could be only, it should be only the first, if many more steps to deal with xenophobia, to deal with anti-Semitism, to deal with the disrespect of minorities like the untouchables in India. The fact is that we need to come to the realization that the populace needs to be recommitted to the very principles of human dignity and the respect of all humankind. And that's going to be a difficult job in light of the fact that we have other challenges that are very real, and that is the pandemic and the economic crisis that's associated with it. But we cannot forget the very important notions of the very basic principles.
Thank you, Ted, for your very clear clarification and your comments. There's one suggestion from one of the participants to David, Dr. Giridhar Lal Sharma from Punjab. He is asking whether it would be possible to display these 20 ways to promote human rights as mentioned by you. If you have something typed out, you can send it to us, and then we can surely share it with the participants. So this is something for David. And then here there's a question from Charles. Charles asks this question. Both of you are very familiar with the Sri Lankan situation. So Charles asks this question. The Sri Lanka has broken the undertaking they undertook at the UNHRC of 30/1 and the subsequent resolution, and finally openly declared that they have no obligations. Can the triple R, triple IR can be revoked in this case? Can IIR be invoked in this case is the question.
Not that one, this one.
This is with regard to Sri Lanka and the resolution 30/1.
Yes, I can say something about that. Well, first of all, in terms of the 20 points, sure, I have a text. I'll make it available. My understanding is that this particular presentation is going to be posted in YouTube anyways, and so people can visit it visually and orally, as well as in writing.
Share screen.
In terms of the shift in Sri Lanka, I did kind of advert to that because
Well, I can
30/1 was accepted by the Sirasena government, but it hasn't been accepted by the Rajapaksa government. You mentioned IRR, but I'm wondering if you meant ICC, the
All right.
International Criminal Court. There are some remedies available. This 30/1 is a resolution of the UN Human Rights Council. The lead for that resolution used to be the United States, but as Dr. Newman has pointed out, the US has withdrawn from the council. Their concern was the politicization, the double standards, and their legitimate concerns. But my view is that they were better off in the room combating the problems of the council than just leaving them. But in any case, in the absence of the United States, the United Kingdom has taken over the leadership on that resolution. And I've actually met with the Foreign Office of the United Kingdom about this issue, about what should be done to follow up on that resolution. And my own view is that the Council, if Sri Lanka is not going to cooperate, should ask the Security Council to deal with the matter, and the Security Council has the authority to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court. Sri Lanka is not a state party to the Rome Treaty, the Treaty for the International Criminal Court, but the treaty allows for a Security Council referral of situations that relate to non-state parties, and they've already done so in relation to Sudan, and they could easily do so in relation to Sri Lanka. So I think that's one possible remedy. Another is the General Assembly has the authority to refer the situation in Sri Lanka to the International Court of Justice through an advisory opinion. And all it requires is, well, it requires a majority vote of the General Assembly. And that is something I would suggest. I mentioned universal jurisdiction before. Many states have it. It can be used. Another thing I think it's worth paying attention to with Sri Lanka is that they're sending a lot of the perpetrators abroad as potential ambassadors or high commissioners, and once it's a way of granting immunity, because people who are ambassadors or high commissioners have diplomatic immunity, and you can't prosecute somebody while they're an ambassador or high commissioner. In Brazil, there was an attempt to prosecute one of these ambassadors, perpetrators. What the human rights organizations did is to ask Brazil to declare the ambassador persona non grata, at which point he would lose his diplomatic immunity. But he left after the request was made, but before it was acted on. We're trying to deal with a similar situation here in Canada, where the Sri Lanka has nominated somebody against whom there's compelling evidence that he's responsible, command responsible for violations in Sri Lanka, and we're seeking to have his nomination refused by Canada. So there are a variety of mechanisms, and this gets back to one of the 20 points I've raised. When you're dealing with human rights violators, there are different ways to deal with them that are available. None of them are guaranteed to work. Many of them are possibilities. All of them should be pursued. And I think the situation with the shift from the Sirasena to the Rajapaksa presidency, although it's bad for human rights, gives us an opportunity to invoke all these mechanisms. That's my answer.
Thank
David,
you.
if
Yeah,
I can
Ted.
ask, David, Security Council presents a problem in terms of the veto. Would you comment about that at all?
Well, of course, it's a problem. You know, if you're going to try to, like, I'm very concerned about human rights violations in China, and it's almost a forlorn effort to try to get the Security Council to refer China to the International Criminal Court, because China is almost certain to veto that. With Sri Lanka, it's less clear because, I mean, obviously it happened with Sudan. It depends upon the strings that the Sri Lankan government can pull, its geopolitical influence. China has so far been in good terms with the Rajapaksa government, but I mean, that could easily change. It's certainly worth trying. And frankly, I think the very request by the Human Rights Council to the Security Council to do that is going to have an impact on Sri Lanka, whether the Security Council acts on it a lot. I mean, a lot of human rights work isn't necessarily just getting the ultimate result. It's making enough noise that the perpetrators want to back off. Very often, when you're dealing with perpetrator regimes, they're trying to maintain at least some modicum of respectability, and human rights noise creates a political cost, which they try to counter in various ways. And one of them, we can hope, and we do see this, is backing away at least from some of their violations. And so I think it's worth, I would say nothing is worth abandoning simply on the basis that it might fail. Yes, it might, but the only way we can be sure it's going to fail is not to try it. So I think we certainly should try it.
David, if I can say to you that we have an opportunity here with the appointment or the soon to be appointed of a new United States ambassador to the United Nations. And I think now is the time that pressure should be put on the new administration, the Biden administration, to pay attention to the Sri Lankan and, of course, the Chinese situation to ensure that American representation on the Security Council will speak out loudly in favor of those who are victimized of human rights. So I think now is the time that both Americans and those abroad should put some effort into ensuring that the Biden administration reassumes its leadership in terms of the international protection of human rights. With all our concerns everywhere, we cannot ignore that we are at a crossroads. We are at a point where there may be hopefully a new re-energized American effort for human rights at the Security Council, and hopefully the United States rejoins the Human Rights Council. So I think now is the time for lobbying and efforts from people worldwide to ensure that the Biden administration takes the appropriate role in the protection of human rights.
Ted, there's a question for you. Thank you. Ted, there's a question for you. Say the question is human rights by a student who asks, human rights are grossly violated by the states. Very often, the same voices are crushed by those who are in power, and they use the institution to do that. And many a times, the innocent are killed. What I want is I want to live and make the world peaceful. Want to ensure the future generation to live in peace and harmony. But I fear for the loss of my dreams if I jump to raise voice unprepared. If I am not prepared well, my voice may be crushed, as seen by the present environment. What to prepare and how to prepare for it so that we would achieve the good strength to fight such violations.
Well, I quite I'm sensitive to the concerns of the person who made that question. And the road is not an easy one. It's a very difficult one. We have failed, and when I say we, I mean educators around the world, to instill in our students a need to advocate for human rights. in our desires for economic well-being, given the concerns that we have in society for our stability and our health and welfare, we have lost efforts to protect human rights. So I think young people ought to be encouraged to take on the championship of human rights efforts. And this requires not just a acceptance of human rights principles, but quite clearly the learning of the details, the processes, the need for organizing. All of that has to be reemphasized. And I must say that I'm at the end of a career. I'm retired. I'm in emeritus status. I worry whether or not those who are teaching, those in the faculties, are doing their jobs of not just teaching details and specifics of human rights processes, but instilling in students a desire to take the mantle of leadership to make human rights a reality. And I think all of us have a responsibility to ensure that there is a new cadre of people who are well trained and motivated to make human rights a true commitment so that the promise is ultimately realized.
Yeah. If I may just follow up on that. Of course, I'm all in favor of knowledge and against ignorance, but I would say that nobody should feel immobilized because they don't feel they know enough, or they don't consider themselves well enough informed. What matters very often in human rights is not so much the extent of the information as the number of people involved. If there's a groundswell of support for respect for human rights, nobody's going to conduct IQ tests of the people who are supporting respect for human rights. I think if you should have a concern, get what information you can, but express it. I would say the same thing about governments. I mean, of course, it's important for the US to get involved in human rights, but I would say no government is too small that its involvement doesn't matter. An example I would give is Gambia. I mean, the human rights violations in Myanmar against the Rohingya have been brought to the International Court of Justice, not by the US and not by any major country, that it's been brought by Gambia. And the court is looking at it. And we were talking about Sri Lanka. Well, Sri Lanka is a signatory to the Genocide Convention. Any state that's a signatory to the convention can bring Sri Lanka to court for the genocide, about which there's compelling evidence during the Civil War. And so I would say generally, I mean, respect for human rights means respect by everybody, but it also means that, I mean, these human rights belong to everybody, and anybody can assert them, not just the well-educated or not just the big countries.
Agreed.
So that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you.
I agree. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Yeah, that's good. Now the next question is to Dr. Matthias. Just a minute. The question is, should human rights include the scope of the widening of poverty?
There are economic and social cultural rights which deal with poverty-related issues, and absolutely, I mean, human rights, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it includes economic, social, and cultural rights and places them at the same level as civil and political rights. There are two covenants that have grown out of the Universal Declaration. One is the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, and another is the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And I would encourage all states to sign both. These covenants have periodic reporting mechanisms, which basically require accountability. They have complaints mechanisms, which are optional, and I would encourage states to opt into them. Getting back to Sri Lanka, I mean, Sri Lanka is a signatory to the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights and a signatory to the optional protocol complaint mechanism, which can be invoked. The and the periodic reporting on economic, social, and cultural rights gives an opportunity for NGOs and concerned human rights individuals to contact the human rights system. There are expert committees that evaluate the reports. They produce concluding recommendations. They will meet with interested NGOs and individuals to get background information. And I would say, if you're concerned about the manner in which poverty is treated in any country, you can engage that system for signatory countries. There's also many theme mechanisms set up by the UN Human Rights Council, and many of them are related to economic, social, and cultural rights. And the theme mechanisms are not treaty-based. They apply to everybody, whether the people of every country, whether countries have signed the treaty or not. And they have expert rapporteurs. And again, if you're concerned about the way poverty is treated in any country, you can engage the theme mechanism set up through the human rights system in Geneva, and they very often will echo the concerns. Indeed, I mean, that's their source of information. People who come to them and express their concerns. So there are definitely mechanisms there which should be invoked for dealing with poverty-related issues.
Thank you.
If I could, Paul, if I can add,
Yes.
David, there are other treaties like the Convention of the Rights of the Child and Convention, the Women's Convention, CEDAW, which includes economic and social rights. And given the fact that children are always a concern of societies and that the women's movement is very well organized, those are opportunities that should not be missed. And let me say that I do believe that there is an opportunity for economic and social and cultural rights at this juncture that may not have existed earlier. Given the fact that there is a great economic stress due to the pandemic and that our health systems are now challenged to such a degree, this may very well be an opportunity to engage people in human rights who have ignored civil and political rights because they didn't feel in any sense that it was a part of their problem. But now that we are dealing with a crisis in health and a crisis in economics, it's an opportunity to enlarge the voice for human rights, to engage people who otherwise may be very not interested in the rights of speech or assembly, but are very much interested in their own health, well-being, and the well-being of their children, and their status as their gender status and the like. Certainly, we have seen that there is threats to the very economic core of a variety of people. And now it's the time for us to say that the human rights theory provides a possible solution to the egregious inequalities of the health system and the economic system that we're dealing with.
Yes, if I could just add one comment to that. I mean, the Convention on the Rights of the Child absolutely is very useful because every single country in the world, except one, the United States, has signed and ratified that convention. It provides a vehicle, and of course, children are very often victims of poverty.
Yeah, there before going to the next question, there are three comments and all in appreciation. The first one is by Jay Chitra, who says that, Sirs Matthias and Orlin, your speeches were awesome and it had a great impact on us. Thank you. The next one is, thank you, sirs, for your guidance. Then one says that very straightforward lecture, sir, an eye opener. And then the next question is, maybe as we are running short of time, you can just be brief. USA, this is to Professor Ted Orlin. It says that USA has been engaged in the worst forms of human rights violations, including the abortion and separation of children. So if USA considers a protector of human rights across the globe, why can't it deal with its own abuses? Ted,
Well, let me
different.
just say to you that never in my life have I been more embarrassed by my own government. I don't want to get political here, in the sense of saying that either the Democrats or the Republicans are more pro-human rights, but the egregious violations of human rights done on the Mexican-American border is unforgivable. And I'm hoping that in the near future, our own judicial system will start address the terrible violations that we have seen for 4 years. So I am not in disagreement to the comment of the individual. I do think that we here in the United States need to address the gross violations of human rights that the administration has done for the last 4 years in a real meaningful way. The first step, fortunately, has been the election of a new regime who hopefully will recommit itself to human rights, both domestically and internationally. And you are quite correct. If America is to reassume its role as a human rights advocate, it needs to address its own problems. And our problems are very real. And I must say, as an American citizen, I am embarrassed by the positions that our administration has taken. And I invite the world, including our neighbors in Canada, to condemn us where condemnation is called for. I am foremost, while I am an American citizen, and I believe in much of what happens, much of the American Constitution, I do believe that we've gone astray. And I think we are open for condemnation and criticism, and I invite the peoples of the world to do that. And I encourage all Americans to put pressure on the new administration to readjust the violations of human rights and to compensate those who have been injured in some real meaningful way. So in some sense, I'm not an apologist for what has happened. I condemn it as much as any human rights advocate around the world should condemn it.
Yes, again, if I may just add something to that. I think one has to, I mean, I make obviously no apologies for human rights violations in the United States or anywhere, but I think one has to take into account a couple of other factors. One is complementarity. There are some situations where there is a functioning local system to deal with violations. And I would say that that's true of the US, and I think that's true of India to a large extent. Part of the complementarity notion is free press, independent judiciary, elected governments. What we do get a certain amount of media distortion in the sense it's a lot easier to find out about human rights violations in democratic countries with a free press than it is to find out about human rights violations in undemocratic countries where there's complete or almost complete censorship. I would not say that the US violations, which the question suggests, is the worst in the world. Far from it. Countries like China, North Korea, Iran, countries where you can't even find out about the violations because there's systematic cover up, except, I mean, I find out about them because I'm a refugee voter. I hear what's happening. It's one of the recommendations I made, investigation, because many of these countries, it requires a substantial investigative effort to find out about these violations. And it's another one of the recommendations I made, speak for others who cannot speak for themselves. The Americans can speak for themselves. We heard Professor Orlin speaking about the United States. It would be very difficult to find someone in China saying about China what Professor Orlin from the US is saying about the US. And so I don't, as I say, making no apologies for what's happening in the US. My own belief is this is a problem, these are problems that the US to a certain extent can, or Americans can correct themselves with solidarity from outsiders. But we cannot forget those people who just can't do and say what Professor Orlin is saying. It's really left up to us alone to deal with those sorts of problems.
David, I'm very sensitive to what you say, and it is absolutely true. But if we are to argue for human rights, we must practice human rights.
That's
and
true.
Therefore, I ask my own countrymen to come to grips with our errors and to make full reparations for those who have been injured and bring to justice those who violate human rights. It's going to be a difficult road ahead, and there are many issues, including the immediate crisis of the pandemic, that have to be dealt with. But as you said earlier, we cannot forget. And I think it's important that we recognize and come to grips with violations of human rights when they happen and not have them ignored. I think of what's happened recently in Germany, where those who were involved in the Holocaust, 90-year-old men, were brought to trial for violations of genocide and other violations of war crimes. And I think that's a good lesson. We cannot just put under a rug and said, oh, that was, and now there's something new. We must come to the realization that children have been separated from their parents at the American-Mexican border. We must come to the realization that our police have acted inappropriately when it comes to people of color. We must come to the realization that our children, many of our children, are not getting the health and well-being that they need. And we must fix our own house. And I strongly agree with you that in places like China, or largely even in places now like Hungary, there are those who cannot speak out for human rights. But in order to us to make the argument that they be allowed to speak, we need to rectify our own faults. And no matter, even if we say that our situation may not be as bad as others, we cannot ignore our own violations of human rights. And I would say the same thing for India. I've spent some time in India with you, Paul, and others, and I know full well that there are millions and millions of Indians who have been abused, and to ignore that abuse is to put some onus on the Indian government to address its own problems. And in the spirit of Gandhi, in the spirit of others, we must cleanse ourselves if we are to argue that others cleanse themselves.
Yeah. Thank you, Ted, and thank you, David. We just have 1 minute, so I give you 30 seconds each to just motivate the students as students from a developing country, how they can be part of international networks wherein they can enforce human rights and protect human rights much more stronger in the context of a country like India. So just 30 seconds each for this. And after that, we will have the vote of thanks. Thank you.
David, you want to begin?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is a question I often get asked, and my answer is basically do something that fits within what you can do. And there's not just, I mean, obviously I'm a lawyer, so I deal with it in a legal way, but it doesn't have to be only a legal way. I mean, artists use their artistry to convey concerns for human rights. You can talk to your neighbors, talk to your social networks, talk to your friends, just do whatever you can within your own sphere of influence and using your own skills. This is not a specialized activity. This is an expression of your humanity, and just make it part of who you are.
Thank you, David.
Paul, if I can suggest that we must realize that we're not alone in the world. And even though we're supposed to be socially distancing now from one another for health reasons, ultimately this pandemic will come to an end. We must join with others who have a common commitment to human rights to make the voice louder and clearer. I would strongly recommend to all peoples, young people especially, that they consider joining NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that they learn about human rights. While I agree with David, not all of us are lawyers, very few of us are lawyers, we should learn the basics. We should understand the mechanisms. And when we speak and advocate for human rights, we should not do it just from the heart, we should also do it from the head. This requires study, this requires understanding of what human rights is and isn't, and then join with one another and speak loudly with clear voices when there are violations of human rights, and make sure that those who are in power and those who have a monopoly of coercion realize that they are being watched, and that the rule of law demands that by their own constitutions, whether it be the Indian Constitution or the American Constitution or the Canadian Constitution, or whether it be the international agreements that they have signed, the law demands that those in power observe and protect human rights. And all of us must speak loudly, separately and together, to say when human rights are violated, that that law has been broken and must be addressed in an appropriate fashion.
Thank you, Ted. To conclude, I want to just read out the message from the principal, Dr. Albert Joseph Smith, who says that excellent presentations, very fair, just, and bold views on human rights violations across all nations in the world. I would say that is what we are present here for, to expose the nefarious designs of the violators and make the world a just place to live. So on this occasion, I thank both of you for accepting my invitation. As we have completely run short of time, I request Dr. Balaji to propose the vote of thanks. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, David. We'll keep in touch.
Thank you, Paul.
It's been wonderful to
Thank
connect.
you, all participants.
Thank you.
Very good evening. It's my privilege to propose a vote of thanks. I, on behalf of St. Joseph's Evening College and the entire organizing team, and on my own behalf, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to the speakers for sharing with us your opinions today. At the outset, I would like to thank our speaker, Professor David Matas, international human rights lawyer, Canada, for enlightening us on human rights, how to make it relevant with the 20 key points. I also wish to express our sincere thanks to Professor Theodore, Professor of Human Rights, New York, for giving us an excellent coverage on the role of youngsters in upkeeping the human rights. I also wish to thank our Reverend Father Brian Pereira, Director, SJEC, for encouraging us to take up such initiatives. I also thank our beloved principal, a visionary, a leader, for encouraging us and motivating us, and also extending his uh, support for making this event a successful one. I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for Dr. Paul Newman, the man behind the success of this event. Without without him, it would have been very difficult for us to even to get an appointment with the eminent international speakers like David and Theodore. Thank you, sir. And further, we are grateful for the organizing team for coming together within a very less short notice and organizing such a great event with great amount of participants. And last but not least, I will also thank all the participants for their active and great involvement in this international webinar. I remain.
Thank you, everyone. Dear participants, the feedback link is posted on the chat box. I request you people to fill the form before you would leave the session. Thank you, and I remain.
Thank you. Good day.